The Southport Homeowners Association demolished my yacht, claiming I hadn't paid HOA fees, even though I don't even live in their neighborhood. That boat was the last thing I had left of my late wife, a floating memory I refused to let fade. Every morning, I'd walk down to the dock, touch the worn teak rail, and hear her laughter in the echo of the waves. But that morning, yellow caution tape fluttered across the mist, and a backhoe's engine roared like a monster waking up. It tore through Blue Haven as if it were junk metal. And there she stood, Marianne Holloway, the HOA president, shouting, "Get it done!" She thought I'd roll over, just another quiet man, too tired to fight. She didn't know the dock she stood on, the one she claimed belonged to the HOA, was mine. You ever seen arrogance meet reality? STAYTUNED. It was 6:45 a.m. when I first heard the metallic grind, a sound that didn't belong in that quiet morning. I was halfway through my first sip of coffee when the vibration rippled through the kitchen window. At first, I thought it was roadwork somewhere up the hill, but then came the second noise, a low mechanical snarl followed by a crack sharp enough to break the air. I knew that sound. It wasn't construction. It was destruction. I set the mug down and ran outside, bare feet hitting the dew-covered grass, my heart pounding in my throat. The fog along the bay was thick, clinging to the air like gauze. I followed the wooden path leading down to the dock, but the closer I got, the more unreal it became. Through the mist, I saw orange vests, hard hats, and a yellow excavator swinging its arm with a brutal rhythm. My dock, the one I'd built with my father 20 years ago, had become a demolition site, and beneath that machine's claw, Blue Haven, my wife's last gift to me, was being torn apart plank by plank. I screamed for them to stop, but the roar of the engine swallowed my voice whole. The men ignored me completely. One of them waved a clipboard as if to signal permission from somewhere above the law. When the machine's bucket slammed down again, it sheared off the bow rail, and a sickening snap echoed across the water. That rail had been her favorite spot, where she'd rest her book and coffee every sunrise. Watching it split open felt like watching a part of her die all over again. I ran toward them, shouting that it was private property, but none of them turned around. And then, standing at the edge of the dock, was Marianne Holloway, 55 years old, pressed suit, pearls gleaming like armor. Her expression was composed, almost smug. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice cool and practiced. "We've sent multiple notices. You left us no choice." Her tone dripped with bureaucracy, that special kind of arrogance reserved for people who think a title makes them untouchable. "Notices," I snapped. "I don't even live in your jurisdiction. You have no authority here." She tilted her head with mock sympathy. "According to our updated boundary filings, this dock falls within Southport HOA's maintenance zone." The excavator struck again, and the hull of Blue Haven cracked open, splitting wide to reveal the cabin I'd built by hand. Inside, the brass compass I'd restored for my wife rolled free and tumbled into the water. I lunged to grab it, but the wave took it first. My knees hit the dock, the salt biting my skin, but I barely felt it. Marianne turned to her foreman and said, "Proceed." That single word sealed the moment in my mind forever. When she walked away, she left behind nothing but dust, splinters, and a sign nailed crookedly to my dock that read, "Property of Southport HOA." I stood there for what felt like hours. The diesel fumes mixed with the sea air until everything smelled of ruin. People talk about rage like it's a fire, but it isn't. It's cold. It sharpens you. It sits in your chest until it finds a purpose. That morning, mine started to take shape. By 8:10 a.m., a deputy arrived, called in by someone from the marina. He was polite, detached, the kind of man who'd seen too many petty HOA disputes. I showed him my deed, tax receipts, everything that proved the dock was mine. He nodded, said it looked legitimate, and promised to file a report. I could already see it in his eyes. This wasn't his battle. He told me to contact the county clerk. Said jurisdictional issues like this could get messy. Messy. That's what they called it when someone's home. Memories and dignity were bulldozed under red tape. I didn't argue. I just nodded. Because I knew shouting wouldn't help. People like Marianne thrived on noise. They folded only under silence, backed by proof. I picked up a broken piece of railing and held it in my hand. It was warm from the sun. Still smelled faintly of varnish and salt. That piece would become my first exhibit. By noon, the tide had pulled most of the wreckage toward the inlet. I waded in and collected what remained a bent cleat, the broken compass cover, the brass plate that still read Blue Haven. I brought them back to my workshop and laid them on the table like evidence. They weren't relics anymore. They were testimony. That night, I stayed up drafting letters, cataloging documents, tracing boundary lines. I wasn't just rebuilding a case. I was reclaiming my dignity. As the sun sank into the horizon, the dock fell silent again, only the waves whispering against the posts. I stood there, watching the last shimmer of light fade across the water, and said softly to the wind, "You made a mistake. Marianne." The air carried it away like a promise, and somewhere beneath the tide, Blue Haven seemed to stir. The fight had only just begun. By the next morning the fog had lifted, but the bitterness stayed thick in the air. The remains of Blue Haven had vanished overnight, scraped away and labeled as debris. What waited for me instead was a printed invoice taped neatly to my front door, demanding $400 for removal services. I stood there for a moment that felt too long, my coffee cooling in my hand as disbelief turned into a quiet laugh. They had destroyed my property and had the audacity to bill me for it. That was when I understood that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a message. They wanted submission, not resolution, and they were betting on me being too small to fight back. At 9:15 a.m., I drove to the Southport HOA office, a spotless glass cube wedged between a bakery and a real estate firm. Inside, the air smelled like lemon polish and quiet arrogance. The receptionist, a woman in her 20s with a perfect bun, did not even look up. "Appointments only," she muttered. I said evenly, "Tell Mrs. Holloway it's about Blue Haven." Her fingers froze for a second before she reached for the phone. The door at the end of the hallway opened, and Marianne Holloway emerged, crisp and poised as ever. "Mr. Harding," she said, smiling like she was greeting a neighbor instead of an accuser. "I assume you are here about the incident," I replied. "You mean the illegal demolition?" She gave a small shrug as if the word illegal were excessive. "We sent notices," she said. "Your dues were unpaid, and under Section 7 we have authority to act." I kept my tone flat. "I am not part of your Section 7. My property lies outside your jurisdiction." Her eyes flickered before she said, "Our updated boundary map places your dock within the Southport district." That single-phrase updated map told me what I needed to know. "Then show me the approval," I said. "It's pending filing," she replied. Pending meant imaginary. I stared at her, voice steady. "So it does not exist." For a fraction of a second, her jaw tightened before she smiled again. "Mr. Harding, you are becoming confrontational. This meeting is over." I watched her turn, the click of her heels sharp against the tile. In her hand, she carried a folder marked Dock Permits. She had been planning this long before the demolition. Outside, I sat in my truck for a while, watching sunlight glare off the HOA windows. Marianne was not careless. She was calculated. She believed authority gave her the right to rewrite reality, and no one had ever challenged that belief. But arrogance is brittle. At 2:30 p.m., I drove to the county records office, a beige building that smelled of dust and resignation. The clerk, an older man with nicotine stains on his fingers, listened carefully as I laid out the story. "You're saying they extended their boundary without filing?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "and they destroyed my property based on that lie." He pulled a thick binder from a drawer and flipped through maps. "As of last month, their border stops 100 yards short of your dock," he said. "No extensions have been recorded." He stamped the map with the county seal and handed me the copy. The paper was still warm from the press. It felt like the first solid thing I had touched since the wreck. If they acted without approval, the clerk said, "That's criminal misuse of authority." Those words were heavy, satisfying. I folded the map carefully and left the office with the first real evidence in my hand. When I got home, another letter was waiting in the mailbox. The HOA logo pressed deep into the envelope like a challenge. Inside was a formal accusation of encroachment on shared property and a warning of possible lien action. I read it twice before smiling. Every threat was another nail in their own coffin. I laid the letter next to the certified map, lining up the dates. They had falsified authority after the fact. A rookie mistake. Around 6 o'clock, I called the sheriff's office to check on my earlier report. The deputy said it was under review. I knew that meant forgotten. Fine. I did not need their urgency. Justice moves faster when you build it yourself. As the day cooled, I walked the dock again, the boards creaking underfoot. The place looked smaller without Blue Haven. Emptier, but not defeated. I could still see my wife sitting on the deck, her book open to the same page she never finished. Marianne had taken the boat, but she could not erase the history beneath her feet. People like her never see what they are stepping on until it gives way. I leaned on the rail and looked out over the water, feeling its patience. Water wears down stone not by force, but by persistence. At 6:50 p.m., I drafted my first formal complaint to the county zoning board and sheriff's department, alleging destruction of private property, falsification of boundaries, and abuse of power. I attached the certified maps, the photos, and copies of every letter. I wrote each line carefully, not as an appeal, but as a record. By the time I signed my name, my anger had cooled into something sharper, precision. Marianne thought she had buried me in paper. She had not realized that paper was where I lived. I sealed the envelope and set it beside the bent compass casing from Blue Haven. One was a relic, the other, a weapon. By nightfall, the tide was low, the dock half lit by the moon. I stood at the edge and let the wind carry the salt into my lungs. In the distance, the lights of Southport flickered like a nervous system. Unaware that one of its nerves had just been cut, justice is never loud. It begins in silence, in small, deliberate steps. I whispered into the dark water, "You will answer for this, Marianne." The waves took my words and carried them outward, as if delivering a message. For the first time since the wreck, I felt something close to balance. The storm was gathering, and this time it would not be mine to endure. It would be hers to face. The following morning arrived clear and sharp, the kind of coastal light that makes every surface look honest. I had not slept more than 2 hours, but clarity had replaced exhaustion. Coffee steamed on the table beside the map copies, and photographs spread across my kitchen like evidence in a quiet war. The county clerk's words echoed in my mind. No boundary extensions filed. That meant everything Marianne had done rested on a lie. The trick was turning that truth into something official before she could twist it further. Bureaucrats like her did not fear moral outrage. They feared documentation. And that, finally, was my weapon of choice. At 8:30 a.m., I began gathering everything that could prove ownership of my dock and the boat that had once moored there. The original deed was locked in a fireproof box, signed by the previous owner 15 years ago. The dock construction permit was dated and approved by the county, showing clear coordinates outside any HOA line. Each document felt like a brick in a wall I was slowly rebuilding around myself. When I called the county zoning board, the clerk confirmed I could submit a formal petition for investigation. She warned me it might take weeks, maybe months. I told her I was not in a hurry, which was only half true. I was patient, because I had to be. But each minute Marianne walked free was an insult. By late morning, I drove to the marina, where a few fishermen were preparing their boats for a weekend outing. One of them, an older man named Henry, who had been docking there for decades, waved me over. Heard about your boat, he said, shaking his head. Those HOA folks been poking around here for months. Tried telling me I needed a permit just to repaint my hull. His voice carried the tired humor of someone used to fighting small tyrants. I asked if he remembered anyone taking pictures or measurements recently. He nodded toward the shore. Couple of suits came by a few weeks ago. Said they were doing a compliance survey. One of them was that woman. The one with the pearls. Marianne. Of course. That confirmed what I suspected. She had started mapping her fabricated boundary long before she claimed it existed. Back home, I printed out the property survey from the county archives, marked every coordinate in red, and highlighted the phrase privately owned maritime structure. Non-association. It was a single line, easy to overlook, but it was everything. The next step was simple but essential. Submit the complaint officially, then prepare for retaliation. People like Marianne never sat idle when challenged. I mailed the documents by certified post and kept the receipt like a badge. When I returned to the house, a white sedan was parked near my driveway. A woman I did not recognize sat inside, typing on her phone. She did not look up, but I noticed the HOA sticker on her windshield. They were already watching. I smiled slightly. Good. Let them. Surveillance cuts both ways. At 3:10 p.m., my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Southport HOA. I let it ring twice before answering. Marianne's voice came through, smooth as glass. Mr. Harding, I understand you have been contacting the county about our administrative oversight, I replied. I have been correcting it. Her tone hardened. These actions only complicate matters. If you withdraw your complaint, we might reconsider the charges for property encroachment. I laughed quietly. Charges? You destroyed my property. She hesitated just long enough for the truth to sting before recovering. Your dock was illegally positioned within community jurisdiction, I said. The county records disagree. Silence followed, the kind that reveals discomfort. Then she said coldly, Be careful. Mr. Harding, sometimes people lose more than boats when they challenge procedures. And she hung up. That was her mistake. Threats always leave traces. I immediately called my lawyer, a retired environmental attorney named Michael Keating, who had handled property disputes for most of his career. He agreed to meet the next morning. Bring everything, he said, and do not talk to them again without me present. I spent the evening organizing my files, labeling each document, and printing the photos of the demolition site, the bent compass casing, the invoice, the fraudulent notice, all of it laid out in order. I began to see the narrative forming: unauthorized action, false jurisdiction, intimidation. It was no longer just a personal grievance. It was a procedural crime. Around 7 p.m., I walked outside to clear my head. The air was cool, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts too clearly. Across the water, lights shimmered from the homes that still belonged to the HOA. They looked peaceful from a distance, but I knew what lived under that surface. Fear disguised as compliance. People there had seen what happened to me, and none of them would dare speak up. Not yet. But once I proved Marianne wrong in public records, silence would turn into whispers, and whispers have a way of becoming testimony. When I met Michael the next morning, his office smelled faintly of sea salt and paper. He examined every document carefully, his brow furrowing at the falsified invoices. This is bad for them, he said. Boundary fraud plus destruction of private property. If the county verifies your claim, the HOA could lose its charter. He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. But they will fight back. Expect noise. Letters, calls, maybe an attempt to frame you as uncooperative. I nodded. They already started. He smiled faintly. Then you are ahead. He drafted a formal notice of intent to sue, phrased so meticulously that even Marianne would hear the trapdoor creak open beneath her authority. By mid-afternoon, I returned home to find tire marks near my driveway gate and footprints along the edge of my property line. Someone had been checking the boundary markers, likely hoping to find an angle to claim more land. I took photos and added them to the file. Each intrusion made my case stronger. At 4:30 p.m., the county board confirmed receipt of my complaint. They promised a review within 10 business days. 10 days felt like an eternity. But it also meant Marianne's timeline for damage control had begun. Bureaucracy could work both ways, once the county touched it. Every paper trail became public record. That night, as the tide rose beneath the dock, I stood with the cold wind brushing against my face. I replayed Marianne's warning in my head, the veiled threat about losing more than boats. It no longer frightened me. It defined her. People like her mistake power for permanence, forgetting that laws outlive fear. I whispered to the dark water, "You are not untouchable, Marianne. You just think you are." The reflection of the moon rippled across the dock like a signature, sealing the promise. I had filed my first strike, quiet and precise, the kind that does not explode. It corrodes. The following morning, I received a call from the county inspector assigned to my case. His name was Randall Price, and his tone was clipped, professional. "Mr. Harding," he said, "I reviewed your complaint and compared it with county zoning maps. It appears your dock is fully outside the Southport boundary." My heart thudded once. "So you will investigate the HOA's claim?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "And if we find they acted without authorization, there will be penalties." When he hung up, I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath since the day Blue Haven fell. It was not victory yet, but it was movement, the first official recognition that I was not crazy, that I had been wronged. As the sun climbed over the bay, the air smelled of salt and resolution. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, the same way I had on the morning everything changed. But this time, the bitterness was different. It was not loss anymore. It was momentum. Marianne had set her little empire in motion against me, believing I would drown in it. What she did not understand was that the tide always turns, and I had just learned how to ride it. Justice had begun to shift beneath her feet, and when it finally broke the surface, it would not whisper, it would roar. The next few days unfolded with the same eerie calm that comes before a storm. I spent most mornings at my desk, sorting through copies of county documents, photographs, and witness statements that were slowly trickling in. Each piece of paper added shape to something larger than a personal grievance. The HOA had overstepped the law, but they had done it systematically, hiding behind signatures and bureaucracy. What unsettled me most was realizing how many people must have looked the other way for this to happen. By the third day, I knew that what happened to me was not an exception. It was a pattern. At 9:20 a.m., Randall Price from the county inspector's office called. His tone was cautious but not unfriendly. "Mr. Harding," he said, "we've opened a formal inquiry into Southport HOA's jurisdictional activities. We've also received 3 other complaints about boundary irregularities." That number froze me for a moment. 3 others, I asked. "Yes," he said. "All within the last year. One of them mentioned a dock being seized and dismantled without notice. It sounded too familiar. The line between coincidence and conspiracy had just blurred. I thanked him and hung up, my pulse quickening, not from fear, but from focus. That afternoon, I drove to Harbor Point, where one of the other victims lived. Her name was Ellen Boyd, a widow in her 60s who had lost her garden shed after the HOA claimed it violated setback ordinances. Her property, like mine, lay outside Southport's true boundary. She met me on her porch, her hands shaking as she poured tea. "They said it was community land," she murmured. "But my husband built that shed 30 years ago. They tore it down while I was at church." I listened, letting her speak until she ran out of words. It was the same arrogance, the same disregard disguised as procedure. When I showed her the certified county map, her eyes filled with tears. "You mean it was illegal?" she asked. "Completely," I said. She nodded slowly, anger replacing shock. By evening, I had met 2 more residents with similar stories. One man, a retired mechanic. Fined nearly $2,000 for unapproved exterior materials. Another had received threats of property seizure for refusing to join the association. It was all there, the overreach, the intimidation, the pattern. The HOA's little empire was not about community maintenance. It was about extraction, built on fear and silence. As I drove back home, the sun dipping low behind the pines, I realized what I needed to do next. This was no longer a personal defense. It was an investigation. At 6:40 p.m., I spread the testimonies across my dining table. Each account mirrored mine, and together they formed a web that pointed to a single architect, Marianne Holloway. Her name appeared in every letter, every fine. She was not just enforcing policy, she was orchestrating it. I drafted a letter to the county board summarizing my findings and included the residents' contact information. I also made a list of every HOA meeting held in the past 12 months. Transparency laws required those minutes to be available upon request. If she had approved actions without votes, it would all be there. The next morning, I called the HOA office pretending to be a journalist researching local governance procedures. The receptionist hesitated, but eventually confirmed that the records could be accessed with a written request. Mrs. Holloway reviews all external inquiries personally, she said. Perfect. That meant Marianne would know someone was digging, but she would not know how much I already had. Within an hour, I submitted the formal request. By noon, I received a short email reply signed by Marianne herself. All HOA activities are compliant with state law. Any further intrusion will be reported as harassment. It was her most desperate move yet, a written attempt at intimidation. What she did not realize was that by responding officially, she had acknowledged receipt of the request, which made it legally binding. She could not withhold them without breaking the law. At 4:15 p.m., I met again with Michael Keating, my attorney, to review the new material. He skimmed through the statements and maps before exhaling through his teeth. "This is bigger than one lawsuit," he said. "If you can connect these incidents through HOA meeting minutes, this becomes a class action case. She'll have to answer for every property violation." He paused, a wry smile flickering. "You might end up dismantling her little kingdom." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of it settle in. It was no longer just justice for Blue Haven. It was accountability for everyone she had bullied. Michael promised to draft a collective notice for all affected residents. "If they agree," he said, "we'll file as a group." That night, as rain began to fall, I sat by the window watching the water ripple across the dock, the same dock she had tried to claim as hers. I thought about Ellen and the others people who had endured quiet humiliation because they believed they had no power. That belief was what sustained Marianne's rule. I began to type a short letter addressed to the affected residents, inviting them to meet at my property on Saturday afternoon. I kept it simple and calm. "We share a problem. The HOA has overstepped its authority. It's time we compare notes." I printed 8 copies, sealed them, and hand-delivered them before midnight. Saturday came bright and windless. At 2 p.m., the first car arrived, followed by 2 more. By 2:30, 6 people stood in my yard. Cautious but curious, we spoke for nearly 2 hours, each story fitting like a missing piece in a puzzle that had been hiding in plain sight. When I laid out the certified maps and county letters, a collective murmur rippled through the group. For the first time, they saw proof that the power holding them captive was built on fraud. "What do we do now?" someone asked. I looked at them and said simply, "We do it properly, through the law." As the meeting ended, Ellen touched my arm. "You know she'll come after you harder now," she said softly. I nodded. "She already has." She smiled faintly. "Then let her. You've already won something she'll never understand." When the last car left, and dusk settled, I walked down to the dock. The rain had cleared, and the moon rose in the distance. A pale coin reflected on the water, for the first time since the demolition. I felt the weight of isolation lift. The fight was no longer mine alone. I had allies, and with them came proof that power built on lies eventually collapses under its own arrogance. I stood there until the tide began to rise again, slow and certain, washing over the scars left by the destruction. The water whispered against the pylons, steady and patient. Justice, like the sea, moves quietly at first. Then, when the time comes, it takes back everything that was stolen. The county investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within a week of our meeting, Randall Price contacted me again. His tone had changed from cautious to firm. "Mr. Harding," he said, "we've reviewed the HOA's submitted documents. Several of their maps appear altered. One bears a digital timestamp that predates the county's own survey by 6 months. That meant Marianne's so-called jurisdictional map was not just premature, it was fabricated." I could hear the tremor in his voice, the professional unease of realizing how deep the manipulation went. "We'll need you and the other residents to attend the public hearing next Tuesday," he added. "The board wants this discussed on record." I agreed immediately. This was the moment the paper war would finally surface. The days leading up to the hearing felt like walking through a tightening coil. Marianne did not contact me directly, but her shadow moved through the neighborhood. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes accusing me of spreading lies, calling me a disgruntled ex-member. Someone even left a note under my truck wiper that read, "Some people don't know when to stop." Fear, once her weapon, now looked desperate. Ellen called one evening, her voice trembling but steady. "They can't silence all of us," she said. "Not anymore." Her courage reminded me why this fight mattered. It was never about revenge. It was about ending a system that thrived on intimidation. The hearing took place in the county's civic center, a dull concrete building whose echo carried judgment more than sound. At 10 a.m., the room filled with residents, board members, and county officials. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, the kind that precedes both justice and spectacle. Marianne arrived flanked by 2 board members, her posture regal, her smile fixed. She wore pearls again, as if symbols of control could still protect her. When the board chair began, the room quieted. Randall presented his findings with careful precision, overlapping boundaries, falsified timestamps, and violation of demolition protocols. Each document projected on the wall was another fracture in her empire. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium with my notes, but I barely needed them. "My name is Lucas Harding," I began. 5 weeks ago, the Southport HOA demolished my yacht, Blue Haven, under a claim that my dock sat within their jurisdiction. County records prove otherwise. They acted without authority, without notice, and without consequence until now. A murmur rippled through the audience. I held up the certified maps and photographs. This isn't about one dock or one boat. It's about people like Ellen Boyd and others who have been extorted under false rules. I looked directly at Marianne, whose calm had begun to crack. "We're not your subjects. You don't own our land, and you never did." Marianne rose abruptly before I could continue. "This is slander," she snapped, voice trembling with controlled rage. "The HOA has operated within its rights for decades. Any errors are clerical, not criminal." Randall turned toward her. "Then perhaps you can explain why your office submitted maps using coordinates from an unregistered survey company." Her mouth opened, then closed. The room held its breath. One of her own board members shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "I didn't sign off on that." That was the first real fracture the moment her loyal facade began to crumble. The board chair asked, "Mrs. Holloway, did you authorize the demolition of Mr. Harding's property?" She hesitated. "It was a collective decision," she said. "We believed we were enforcing community standards." The chair's voice sharpened. "Belief is not authorization. We operate on law, not assumption." A ripple of approval moved through the crowd. Marianne's smile vanished completely. The projection screen behind her now showed the falsified map beside the authentic one. The difference was undeniable. Her version extended the HOA boundary by 100 yards, swallowing private land that never belonged to them. As the evidence mounted, the tone of the hearing shifted from debate to exposure. One resident stood up, then another, each sharing their story of fines, threats, or property loss. The board members sat pale and silent, while Marianne's empire dissolved in front of her. I could see it in her eyes she was still trying to calculate a way out. But the math no longer worked. The weight of her own arrogance had become public record. When the board chair finally spoke again, his words were measured but final. Pending review of this evidence, Southport HOA's leadership is hereby suspended. A full audit will be conducted. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was steady, deliberate, like the sound of chains breaking. After the session ended, Marianne tried to leave through the side door, but reporters and residents crowded her path. Ellen stood nearby, calm and upright, holding her certified letter as if it were a badge. "You took what didn't belong to you," she said softly as Marianne passed. For the first time, the woman who had ruled with intimidation had nothing to say. Her silence was the sound of defeat. She pushed past the crowd, her pearls catching the light like a broken promise. Outside the Civic Center, the afternoon sun felt different, cleaner somehow. Michael clapped my shoulder. "That was the beginning of the end," he said. "Now comes the paperwork. But the worst is behind you." I looked at the group of residents talking quietly among themselves, their faces lighter than I'd ever seen them. They had spent years under her shadow, and now they were stepping into daylight. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration. 2 days later, the county released a statement confirming violations of zoning law, property destruction, and falsified records. Marianne was ordered to relinquish her position pending criminal review. The HOA's operations were frozen until a legal administrator could take over. I read the notice twice, letting the words sink in. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability, delivered in the same sterile language she had once used to justify cruelty. That evening, I returned to the dock. The air smelled of salt and cedar, the tide brushing softly against the pilings. I thought about Blue Haven, about the years my wife and I spent on that boat, and about the people who had found their voice because of it. From the shore, I could see the faint shimmer of the county courthouse lights across the bay. Marianne had tried to own what wasn't hers, and now she would face the cost of pretending power made her untouchable. I stood there until the sky turned dark, watching the moon carve a pale path across the water. The dock was still scarred, but it stood unchanged, unbroken, and legally mine. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived exactly when it was meant to. Somewhere inland, Marianne Holloway was probably drafting her excuses, searching for a way to shift the blame. But truth, once spoken in public, has a way of echoing louder than any defense. I smiled faintly and whispered to the water, "It's over." The tide rolled in, quiet and certain, carrying the sound of closure with it. By the end of the week, the county prosecutor's office had taken over the case. The news came through a short, clipped phone call from Randall Price early Monday morning. "Lucas, we've confirmed multiple counts of falsified documentation. Mrs. Holloway is officially under investigation." His voice carried both relief and disbelief, as though even he had not expected the case to escalate so quickly. I stood by the window, watching the dock shimmer in the morning light, the tide rolling in like a patient witness. For months, I had fought to prove what seemed obvious, and now the machinery of justice was finally catching up. But victory, I realized, didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, inevitable, like gravity. Over the next few days, subpoenas arrived at the HOA office, followed by quiet visits from county auditors. Trucks rolled in, boxes of files were removed, and staff members avoided eye contact with anyone passing by. Michael called that afternoon, his tone measured. "The audit's already turning up anomalies: unauthorized bank transfers, missing invoices, payments to contractors that don't exist. It's not just zoning violations anymore. It's financial misconduct." He paused, letting the implication hang. If they prove she used HOA funds for private gain, it becomes a criminal offense. I said nothing for a moment. Trying to absorb it, Marianne had built her empire on control, but greed had hollowed it from within. 2 days later, Ellen stopped by with a pie and a nervous smile. "They say she's been called in for questioning," she said. "Is it true?" I nodded. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, she exhaled, almost laughing. I never thought I'd see the day. We sat on the porch as the sun set, sharing quiet satisfaction that felt more like peace than revenge. She looked toward the dock, her eyes distant. "You think she'll ever admit she was wrong?" I shook my head. "People like her don't admit. Ellen. They get exposed." The next morning, I parked near the courthouse and waited. At 9:15, Marianne arrived flanked by her attorney, her face pale and rigid. No pearls this time. Cameras clicked. Questions flew, but she said nothing. The same woman who once ordered demolitions with a smirk now stared straight ahead, her power stripped by her own arrogance. Inside, the hearing was brief. Randall later told me she invoked her right to remain silent when confronted with the falsified signatures. But the real twist came later that afternoon, when the county released a public statement confirming the discovery of a shell account linked directly to her personal finances. HOA funds had been rerouted for consulting services that led straight to her own business. The deception was no longer administrative. It was criminal. By Thursday, the county board voted to dissolve the current HOA leadership entirely. Temporary trustees were appointed to oversee restitution and rebuild trust with the community. For the first time, people were free from the quiet fear that had ruled them. When I visited Ellen that evening, she showed me a letter from the board acknowledging the wrongful demolition of her shed and offering compensation. "It's not about the money," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's about hearing them say they were wrong." I nodded. That acknowledgement was what we had all been fighting for, a public correction of an old lie. A week later, I received my own letter. The county confirmed that the HOA would cover full damages for the destruction of Blue Haven, including legal costs and restoration of dock rights. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. The boat was gone, and no payment could bring it back. But this was not about the boat anymore. It was about the principle that no one, no matter how small their kingdom, has the right to take what isn't theirs. Justice, when it comes, does not shout. It arrives like the tide, slow, steady, undeniable. On Friday, I was called to testify in a closed session, a procedural step in the formal indictment. The room was small, almost plain, with the faint smell of old paper and varnish. I sat before a panel of officials who asked precise questions, dates, documents, procedures. I answered calmly, my memory sharp, every word grounded in fact. When they asked how I first realized the HOA had exceeded its jurisdiction, I said simply, because they destroyed something they didn't own. There was a pause. Then one of the officials nodded. That's exactly what this case is about. Outside. The air was crisp with the scent of rain. Reporters waited near the steps, but I walked past them without a word. There was nothing left to explain. The story now belonged to the public record, and that was where it should stay. Marianne's indictment came 3 days later, 3 counts of fraud, 1 of property destruction, and 1 of abuse of authority. She was released on bail, pending trial, but her reputation was already in ruins. Former allies distanced themselves, and residents who once feared her now spoke openly about her bullying. The empire she built on fear was collapsing faster than she could defend it. A month after the first hearing, I received a notice confirming the dock's full reinstatement under my name. Standing there, watching workers reinstall the final railings, I felt a quiet completion settle in. The space where Blue Haven once floated was empty, but not hollow. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and memory. I could almost hear my wife's laughter again. The echo of summers long past. Ellen joined me, her face soft in the afternoon light. "It's over," she said gently. I nodded. No, it's corrected. That word felt truer than any other. This wasn't revenge. It was balance restored. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I walked the length of the dock one last time before leaving for home. The boards creaked softly under my feet, familiar and forgiving. For months, I had lived with anger like a stone in my chest, but now it had dissolved, replaced by something steadier. The law had done what rage never could. Justice had been delivered not through shouting or violence, but through patience, evidence, and truth. I paused at the edge, staring at the still water that reflected the faint glow of the courthouse lights across the bay. Marianne Holloway might still deny her guilt, but her silence had become her confession. The dock stood quiet under the rising moon, each ripple whispering of closure. Somewhere inland, legal documents were being stamped, charges filed, and systems corrected. But out here, by the water, it was enough to breathe, to feel the weight of it lift, and to know that what was broken had finally been set right. Justice had arrived not as thunder, but as the calm that follows it. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to heal. The dock, once a place of loss, had become a quiet symbol of reclamation. The county finished its restitution process, and the residents formed a new association built on transparency and respect. I was asked to chair the advisory council, but I declined. My part in this story was done. I preferred to watch from the water's edge, where the tide met the pilings and the breeze carried the scent of cedar. Justice didn't erase the past, but it restored balance. Blue Haven was gone, yet its memory had rebuilt something larger than wood or paint. It had rebuilt faith. Marianne Holloway faced her trial in early spring, and the verdict was swift guilty on all counts of fraud and property destruction. The sight of her being escorted out of the courthouse wasn't satisfying in a cruel way. It was simply right. She had tried to dominate through fear, but in the end, the law had spoken louder. The residents who once bowed their heads now stood taller, unafraid. The truth had become our shared inheritance, and peace had returned, steady as the tide. Now, when I stand at the dock at dusk, I don't see what was taken. I see what endured dignity, law, and the quiet certainty that no power is absolute. Some storms come to wash away arrogance, not hope. The water glows gold beneath the fading sun. Soft waves lapping against the pier that once marked the beginning of my loss, and now marks renewal. Justice came not with anger, but with patience, and that patience changed everything. If stories like this remind you why truth matters, and why calm justice will always outlast corruption, support Gated Drama, because every neighborhood has its secrets, and every story deserves its reckoning.